Who actually killed the genius who built one of the greatest bands in rock history and then vanished from it entirely? What if the people who did the killing were the very friends who went on to become rich and famous off the songs he wrote? By the end of this story, the line between victim and perpetrator will blur so badly you'll question everything you thought you knew about Pink Floyd. Before Pink Floyd was a stadium-filling institution, it was Syd Barrett's band. He founded it in 1965 alongside Nick Mason, Roger Waters and Richard Wright, and it was Barrett who gave the group its strange, memorable name, borrowed from two obscure American blues musicians, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. In those earliest days, Barrett wasn't just a member of the lineup. He was its centre of gravity, the one whose ideas shaped what the band actually sounded like. That centrality showed up everywhere in the band's earliest work. Barrett wrote the vast majority of the songs on the group's debut album, including the singles Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, tracks that carried his strange, playful, faintly unsettling songwriting voice into the British charts. This wasn't a supporting player contributing the occasional verse. This was a 20-year-old effectively writing the blueprint for one of the most influential bands in music history, almost entirely on his own. The results speak for themselves. Released in August 1967, the debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, reached number 6 on the UK Albums Chart, a genuinely impressive showing for a band still finding its footing. And there's a detail that makes the moment even more striking. The album was recorded in the same room, Abbey Road Studio 2, where the Beatles were simultaneously working on SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The two bands are said to have crossed paths in the studio more than once. Two very different visions of psychedelia, sharing the same walls at the same time. Is it fair to call that a coincidence, or was Barrett genuinely operating at the same creative altitude as the biggest band on the planet, for a brief moment in 1967? Whatever the answer, what came after his departure from Pink Floyd tells its own quiet story. Barrett released 2 solo albums, The Madcap Laughs and Barrett, both in 1970, and neither found meaningful commercial success. The songwriter who had once matched pace with the Beatles in the same studio was, within 3 years, releasing records that barely registered with the public. It's hard not to wonder what he might have made if the trajectory of 1967 had simply continued, if the mind that produced See Emily Play in his early 20s had been given another decade to work. Instead, something started going wrong almost immediately, and it happened faster and more visibly than most people realise. What exactly derailed a talent that promising, and how early did the signs actually start to show? The unravelling didn't wait for the band's fame to peak. It started showing up while they were still climbing. At a performance on January 20, 1967, at All Saints Church Hall in London, Barrett was reportedly seen standing on stage without playing at all, simply standing still or looking confused in front of the audience. It's one of the earliest documented moments where something had visibly shifted in him, months before the wider public would have any reason to notice. The strangeness wasn't limited to live shows. There's recorded evidence of Barrett tracking a song called Have You Got It Yet? With the band during rehearsals in late 1967, and each time the band tried to play along, he changed the melody, making it functionally impossible for anyone to follow him. Whether it was a cruel joke at his bandmates' expense or a genuine sign that something had come loose, nobody in the room could be sure, and that uncertainty was itself part of the problem. Underneath these episodes sat a much more concrete factor. Barrett was consuming enormous quantities of LSD through 1966 and 1967. Friends later estimated he had used it dozens of times over the span of just a few months, a pace that friends and biographers link directly to the psychotic episodes that began appearing around him. This wasn't recreational use on the margins of his life. By most accounts, it had become a near-constant presence during the exact period he was expected to be writing, recording, and performing at a professional level. There is a real clinical dimension to what may have been happening. LSD-induced psychosis is a documented condition in medical literature, and researchers at Stanford reference Barrett's case specifically in a 2005 lecture on the long-term effects of psychedelic drugs. Separately, a 2010 psychiatric analysis published in the journal Medical Hypotheses suggested Barrett may have experienced a mild form of schizophrenia compounded by anxiety disorder, though it's worth being clear that no formal diagnosis was ever made or published while he was alive. These are retrospective readings, not confirmed medical history. None of this happened in a vacuum. The band's touring schedule in 1967 was brutal by any standard, more than 80 shows in the final 6 months of the year alone, and that relentless pace is widely cited as one of the accelerants that pushed Barrett's condition from strange to unmanageable. A young man already struggling with drug-induced instability was simultaneously being asked to perform, travel, and record at a pace that would exhaust a stable adult. Whatever was happening to Barrett clearly wasn't a mystery to the people standing next to him on stage. The much harder question is what they chose to do about it, and whether doing something was ever really on the table. How a band responds when one of its own is falling apart says as much about the band as it does about the person in crisis. For Pink Floyd, that response has never been described gently, least of all by the members themselves. Roger Waters, in a 1970 interview, stated flatly that Barrett had lost his mind to drugs, and said he felt no guilt about the decision to replace him, a comment that landed as coldly then as it reads now. The formal break came on April 6, 1968, when Pink Floyd announced that David Gilmour would take over for Barrett, who left the band shortly afterward. Gilmour himself, in a 1968 interview, described Barrett as having become completely off his head, calling the replacement decision inevitable if the band was going to survive at all. Two of the people closest to Barrett, in other words, were also two of the people most willing to speak about his decline in the harshest possible terms. But the picture isn't purely one of abandonment. In 1967, before things reached a breaking point, the band arranged for Barrett to have a personal driver, since he was no longer able to drive himself to shows, a small, practical accommodation that suggests genuine effort to keep him functioning within the group for as long as possible. It's a detail easy to lose amid the harsher quotes, but it complicates any simple story of a band that never tried. Still, the support didn't last. The band's management contract with Peter Jenner and Andrew King of Black Hill Enterprises was terminated in mid-1968, almost immediately after Barrett's exit, as though the professional relationships built around him collapsed the moment he was no longer at the centre of the operation. Was that a coincidence of business timing, or a sign that the entire structure supporting Barrett had been built around his usefulness rather than his well-being? Peter Jenner himself later offered one of the starkest first-hand accounts of just how far things had gone. He recalled a 1967 performance where Barrett stood on stage strumming a single chord for the entire set. When the band tried to adjust and pull him back in, Barrett didn't correct himself. He simply turned and stared out at the audience with an empty expression. Jenner said he knew in that moment that something was deeply wrong and that the band couldn't be saved anymore, at least not in the form it had existed in. If even the band's own manager was describing the situation as unsalvageable, the decision to move on starts to look less like betrayal and more like triage. But triage still has a cost, and the person who paid it wasn't in the room to argue his side. Barrett's final real attempt to return to music came in 1972 with a short-lived band called Stars. It fell apart after just 4 shows, undone by the same problem that had ended his time with Pink Floyd years earlier. Barrett would stand on stage holding his guitar, not playing. What had once looked like a fixable rough patch now looked like a pattern that wasn't going away, no matter who he played with or how much time had passed. A separate account from music critic Ian MacDonald, writing for the New Musical Express, described Barrett as having literally collapsed on stage during a performance in February 1968 and being taken back to his hotel afterward. It's a small, brutal image, a performer physically giving out under the weight of whatever was happening to him, in front of an audience that had come expecting a show. Some of what followed was less about Barrett's mental state and more about the business surrounding him. His original recording contract with MI Fame Studios, signed in January 1967 when he was just 21, was reportedly one of the more lopsided deals of its era for a young artist, leaving him with only a thin percentage of the revenue his own records generated. A young man already struggling to hold himself together was, at the same time, locked into a contract that barely rewarded him for the work he was still managing to produce. Eventually, the public story ends the way so many of these stories do, with retreat. Barrett spent the next 40 years living quietly at his mother's house in Cambridge, never giving another public statement after 1972, while still collecting royalties from Pink Floyd's ongoing success. His mother, Winifred, urged him to move in with her in 1969 and shielded him from media attention until her death in 1990. after which he continued living alone in the same reclusive pattern she had helped establish. There's a quieter tragedy buried in the numbers too. Barrett wrote more than 40 songs during the 1966-1968 period, but only around 25 to 30 were ever recorded, the rest lost or simply never finished, existing now only as a kind of shadow catalogue of what might have been. By every visible measure, the man who had once matched the Beatles in the same recording studio was gone, replaced by someone the public would only glimpse in old photographs and second-hand stories. The question that lingers isn't just what happened to him. It's whether the people who once called him a friend played any part in pushing him toward that isolation. Decades later, some of that question finally got an answer, at least in part. Roger Waters, in a 2013 interview, admitted that the band had not treated Barrett well and that they had handled the situation clumsily, while still maintaining that no one had set out to intentionally harm him. It's an important distinction, and also a slippery one. Clumsy and careless can produce the same outcome as cruelty, even when the intent behind them is completely different. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Failing to protect someone isn't the same as attacking them, but the person on the receiving end doesn't necessarily experience much of a difference. A friend who quietly steps back while you fall apart, and a friend who actively pushes you out, can leave you in exactly the same place, alone. The most striking evidence of genuine reflection came decades after the fact, in the 2023 documentary, Have You Got It Yet? For the first time in years, David Gilmour and Roger Waters appeared together to discuss Barrett directly, and both expressed real regret over how his departure from the band had been handled. It's a rare moment of two men who had spent decades giving hardened, defensive answers about Barrett, finally allowing something softer into the record. Even Peter Jenner, the band's own former manager, offered something close to an apology in his own 1996 interview, describing Barrett as someone who wandered into a place he didn't belong, and admitting maybe we should have given him more time. Coming from the person who had managed the business relationships around Barrett, that admission carries a particular weight. A suggestion that the professional machinery around him moved faster than his well-being ever could. It's worth placing Barrett's story next to similar cases from the same era. Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac, diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1971, and Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys both faced comparable struggles with mental health inside high-pressure bands. What sets Barrett apart is stark. He is the only one of the three who never made any real attempt to return to music afterward. Green eventually returned to performing. Wilson, despite decades of documented struggle, kept creating. Barrett simply stopped. So was it clumsiness, or was it something closer to abandonment, dressed up in kinder language decades later? Maybe the honest answer is that it doesn't have to be one or the other, and that the softer word is easier to live with, precisely because the harder one is too heavy to say out loud. Here's where the story most people know starts to fall apart. Barrett did not die broke, forgotten and destitute. Contrary to the popular image of a ruined, penniless artist, he had more than enough financial stability to live comfortably in the very house his mother had purchased, at 83 St Margaret Square in Cambridge, right up until his death. The numbers make the myth even harder to sustain. Legal documents released after Barrett's death in 2006 estimated his total estate at roughly £2 million, a figure that directly contradicts the popular image of a starving artist, rock's answer to the tragic pauper genius. Where did that money come from? Largely from the songs he had written decades earlier. After leaving the band, Barrett lived off royalties from his own compositions, estimated at somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000 a year through the 1970-2000 period, equivalent to roughly £300,000 to £450,000 today. It wasn't a fortune by rock star standards, but it was more than comfortable, and it flatly contradicts any image of a man abandoned to poverty by the industry he'd helped build. That royalty stream traces directly back to work he did at the absolute peak of his creative output. See Emily Play, released as a single in 1967, reached number 6 on the UK singles chart, but Barrett never appeared on the television programmes meant to promote it, sidelined by his own deteriorating mental state, a gap that likely cost the single, and Barrett himself, a wider audience at the exact moment his career needed one. The contrast with the band he left behind is almost impossible to overstate. Since Barrett's departure, Pink Floyd has released 15 studio albums and sold more than 250 million records worldwide. Barrett's own solo output, 2 albums, fewer than 1 million copies combined, sits at the opposite end of the spectrum entirely. One half of that founding partnership became one of the best-selling acts in music history. The other quietly cashed royalty checks in Cambridge. So which version is the real tragedy? A genius erased by mental illness, or a man who, once pushed out of an industry that had exhausted him, chose comfort and privacy over chasing a spotlight that had already cost him so much? The financial record suggests his retreat may have been less a defeat than a decision. If Barrett stopped making music, he never actually stopped creating. During his decades away from the public eye, he turned to painting, and some of that work has survived and been shown publicly. A 2019 piece from his reclusive years sold at auction for £1,000. Quiet proof that the impulse behind See Emily Play hadn't vanished so much as changed medium entirely. Not every glimpse of his private life was so gentle, though. A 1973 interview in the Cambridge Evening News quoted a neighbour describing Barrett as walking around the neighbourhood like someone with no soul left, after moving back in with his mother, adding that there were moments he seemed to see something the rest of us couldn't. It's an unsettling image, offered by someone who saw him not as a rock legend, but simply as the strange quiet man down the street. Barrett rarely spoke publicly about his old life, but there is one striking exception. In a rare 1982 interview with the Cambridge News, a reporter asked him about his past, and he answered simply, "I don't want to talk about that. The past is the past." It stands as the last public statement of his ever recorded, 5 words that closed the door on an entire era of his life more firmly than any biography could. Was that silence a wound he never recovered from, or a boundary he'd simply chosen to protect what was left of his peace? Either way, the world outside Cambridge never fully let go of him. In June 2023, a memorial concert held in his honour sold out in just 30 minutes, with more than 2,000 people applying for only 300 available seats. Proof that public fascination with Barrett had, if anything, grown stronger in the years since his death. Even the most mundane details of his later life took on outsized value to people who never knew him. In 2007, a photograph of Barrett at his Cambridge home sold at auction for £10,000. The last known public image of him before he died, showing a man who looked calm, if visibly older than his years. A single photograph worth £10,000, simply because it was proof he was still there. Maybe that's the clearest evidence that his creativity never actually ended. It just stopped being something the public was allowed to see. Nothing captures the strangeness of Barrett's later years better than a single afternoon in 1975. Pink Floyd was recording Wish You Were Here at Abbey Road Studios, a song written specifically about him, when a heavyset, bald man with shaved eyebrows wandered into the studio. For a stretch of time, none of them recognised who he was. It was Barrett, the band he had co-founded, sitting in the exact room where they were finishing a song mourning his absence, didn't know their own former bandmate on site. When the realisation finally landed, it reportedly hit Roger Waters hard enough that he was moved to tears and left the room without being able to say anything at all. There may not be a more haunting image in the entire history of rock music than that. Grieving someone in song, while he was, without their knowledge, standing right behind them. Barrett spent the rest of his life almost entirely out of public view. He never married and had no children, according to his family's confirmation at the time of his death. He died on July 7, 2006, in Cambridge from pancreatic cancer, at the age of 60, a quiet private ending that stood in sharp contrast to the very public mythology that had grown up around him. The band's tribute to him had, in a sense, already been written decades earlier. Shine On You Crazy Diamond, released in 1975, runs more than 26 minutes across its full form on Wish You Were Here, an unmistakable sprawling elegy for the friend they had lost long before he actually died. In 1996, when Pink Floyd was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the 3 remaining members all publicly thanked Barrett during the ceremony, though he himself never appeared to receive any part of that recognition. And when news of his death reached the public in 2006, Waters made a brief public statement saying he hoped Barrett had finally found peace, adding that his memory would always remain part of Pink Floyd. Not long after, the surviving members reportedly gathered to rework Shine On You Crazy Diamond for a compilation release, and by most accounts they didn't speak to each other the entire session. They just played. Step back from Barrett's individual story, and a much bigger pattern comes into focus, one that says less about him personally and more about how the music industry and the public have historically thought about creative genius and mental illness. A 2020 NME survey of 1,000 musicians found that 68% believed creativity is often linked to mental disorder, and Barrett was frequently cited as a leading example, a real measurable reflection of just how deeply the mad genius myth has taken hold in popular culture. There's a more clinical layer underneath that myth too. A 2012 study published in the journal Psychology of Music surveying 200 musicians found that 45% experienced symptoms consistent with performance-related anxiety disorders, yet only about 10% had ever received a formal diagnosis. Viewed through that lens, Barrett's unravelling starts to look less like a singular, unexplainable tragedy, and more like an extreme version of a pattern that quietly affects a huge share of working musicians. Researchers have since placed Barrett's collapse among the earliest well-documented cases of what would now be called creative burnout, driven by a combination of substance use and the crushing pressure of sudden success. A 2015 study from the University of East London specifically highlighted social isolation as a factor that worsens mental illness in creative artists, a detail that reads almost like a direct commentary on the 40 years Barrett spent alone in Cambridge. It's worth sitting with just how much was lost. A 2018 analysis in New Scientist estimated that, had Barrett not collapsed when he did, he might have gone on to produce as many as 50 albums or more over a full career, extrapolating from the astonishing rate at which he wrote during his brief 2 years of peak activity. 50 albums from a catalogue that in reality stopped at 2. None of this is only about Syd Barrett. If someone close to you were showing similar warning signs today, sudden withdrawal from people they used to trust, a noticeable shift in how much they're using drugs or alcohol, moments where they seem disconnected from what's actually happening around them. Those are exactly the kinds of changes worth paying attention to, and worth acting on early, rather than waiting to see if they pass on their own. Getting a mental health professional involved sooner rather than later, and making sure the person doesn't end up isolated the way Barrett was for 4 decades, can genuinely change how that story ends. Creating space for someone to talk without fear of judgment is often the simplest and hardest part of all of it. So who actually killed the genius behind Pink Floyd's earliest, strangest brilliance? The honest answer isn't a single name. It wasn't just the LSD, though that clearly played a defining role. It wasn't just the band, even though their own words, clumsy, cold, sometimes strikingly honest decades later, show real fault lines in how they handled a friend who was falling apart in front of them. It wasn't even just the unforgiving pace of an industry that expected a 20-year-old to keep producing brilliance on demand. No single person carries this alone, but that doesn't mean the weight was shared equally. Barrett is the one who spent 40 years in near-total silence. Barrett is the one whose songwriting stopped at a fraction of what it could have been. Whatever mix of chemistry, pressure and human failure caused his collapse, he is the one who paid for it for the rest of his life. And yet the story doesn't end in total tragedy. He wasn't destitute, he kept painting. He lived by most accounts on his own terms, in the house his mother left him, for as long as he wanted to, in its own quiet, private way, still a life. Just not the one the public expected him to live, and not the one his old friends ever fully understood until it was too late to say so to his face. If you had to name the one thing that failed Syd Barrett, the drugs, the band, the industry, or simply the era's total lack of understanding about mental illness, what would you choose? Leave your answer below, and if this kind of story stays with you, there are more like it. Rock legends whose brilliance came at a cost nobody saw coming until it was already too late.